Hi, for anybody who might be seeing this lecture significantly in the future, I'm wearing the Frankenstein shirt today because I'm recording this 1 week before Halloween. So anyway, I'm going to get on to a discussion of Chapter 22, Coping with Change in the New Industrial Era. Now, in the previous chapter, we talked about how the Industrial Revolution had changed life inside of Britain and other industrializing countries, but there were a number of other major changes that happened too. Now, one of the first things that this chapter talks about is the movement of people. Now, some movements came to an end. The transatlantic slave trade came to an end. And there were a number of reasons for this. There was a great deal of moral anxiety about slavery. And then also, with the exception of cotton, the demand for slave-produced agricultural products in the Western Hemisphere just was not as strong as it was. It did not make financial sense to continue the slave trade into the Caribbean. Brazil still made a lot of money from slavery, and Cuba actually kind of got a boost in slavery from the fall of Haiti. A lot of Haitian slave owners moved to Cuba. But those were the two small exceptions. The one large exception, of course, was the United States, because the Industrial Revolution in Britain created a huge market for American cotton, and the invention of the cotton gin made it possible to process a short staple cotton, the kind of cotton that can grow in the United States. It made it possible to produce that in numbers large enough to be commercially viable. Now, one interesting thing, however, is that the ending of the transatlantic slave trade did not end slavery in Africa. One of the things, now the book doesn't mention this so much, but one of the things that happens is that in Africa, during the development of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, a market really begins to grow for raw products in Africa. In particular, things like peanuts and peanut oil, coconut oil. There is an increasing market for wood coming out of Africa. There's a huge market for ivory. The piano becomes a really significant status symbol for a lot of middle-class people, and the keys on pianos were made out of ivory. Also, billiard balls. Billiards pool became more popular, and that became a significant market for ivory too. Exotic feathers from ostriches and other birds became a major market in Europe. And so what happens is that a lot of slave labor is put to work producing these things. One other thing that's produced also are cloves. That's cloves, that are used in cooking. They were produced off the east coast of Africa on the islands of Zanzibar and Tanzania. And so that became another slave-produced trade item that became more popular. Now, one of the major things that happens, however, is that there are huge movements of people during the 19th century. In particular, a lot of people leave Europe in order to find a better life. Millions of people begin to move to the United States. A lot of people move into Latin America, especially southern Brazil, Chile, Argentina. And there are a number of other movements. For instance, Australia gets a significant European population. Australia starts off as a penal colony, but then eventually, once gold's discovered, even more people move there. Within the Russian Empire, Russia pushes further east and is able to gain control of northern Siberia, which is the polar region, and also southern Siberia, which borders on China and Mongolia. the Russians had started the process of moving into Siberia a couple of hundred years earlier, back in the 17th century. But at that time, Russia and China were much more evenly matched militarily. Matter of fact, China was stronger. But by the time you get to the 19th century, Russia has a more modern military, and the Chinese government is really suffering pressure from all sides. It's suffering pressure on its coast from Britain and other countries, and the Russians are putting in pressure from the interior. And so this means that Russia is able to get more territory and is able to expand. And also, as the book mentions, indigenous people who lived in the interior of Siberia have been isolated enough from population centers that when ethnic Russians came into their territory, they brought diseases that really decimated those people, the way Native Americans and Native Australians and a number of other people had been hurt when there was a movement of settlers. Now, in addition to this, as the book mentions, people from Asia also began to migrate. Chinese people were encouraged to come to places like the United States and work on railroads. Now, in the case of the United States, there were very, very restrictive laws that basically allowed for men to come, but made it very difficult for women to come. So quite often Chinese came and then were sent back. People of Indian extraction had a different experience. A lot of people of Indian extraction were brought to the Caribbean after the end of slavery because many of the former slaves wanted to have a life other than be on the plantation. And so a lot of Indians came there and worked as indentured laborers. They worked for a few years, and then they got their freedom and they established businesses and other things. That's why countries like Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname have very large East Indian populations today. Similarly, in South Africa, Indians were imported there because at that point in South African history, African farmers, excuse me, were doing so well that they were not interested in working for white settlers. And so therefore, people from the Indian subcontinent were brought in, especially in Natal and eastern South Africa, to work in sugarcane plantations. Now, basically, by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, there's significant European economic and settler penetration in most corners of the world. Like the book mentions, even in the Pacific Basin, in Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, further to the northwest, or northeast, I guess, if you're going from the direction of China. You have significant European population, and therefore, for the first time, and this is something the book could have mentioned a little bit more, but it's really important. Really, for the first time, the entire world is pulled into a single economic unit. Now, what we see is that with this increasing economic activity, there's a gradual increase in living standards. And also what we see too is a really intensification of the notion of nationalism. The idea that people who have a common history, common language, common culture, quite often common religion, should live in a state that they politically control themselves. And so because of this, there becomes a really increasing pressure for nation states. And in Europe in particular, we see consolidation of a couple of major nation states. By 1861, Italy becomes a nation state. By 1871, Germany becomes a nation state. However, and this is something that we'll see more in future chapters, in a lot of Eastern Europe, there was a great deal of ethnic diversity, and the borders between different ethnic groups weren't that clearly defined. And so eventually this would lead to a lot of competition and hostility, and would be a major factor in the outbreak of World War I early in the next century. But that's getting just a little bit ahead of the story. Now, in reaction to the notion of nationalism and the spread of capitalism, we see the development of socialism. Now, early socialists, people like Claude Henri de Saint-Simon, were what were often referred to as utopian socialists. They wanted to build nice societies where there was equality, where workers had a share in profits. Somebody like Robert Owen was the same way. What we see, however, is that eventually Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed the theories of Marxism that saw capitalism and nationalism as inherently bad and inherently against the interest of working people. Now, Marx, the book doesn't really mention it too much, but Marx really was kind of a philosophical philosopher, a philosophical follower of the German thinker Hegel. And, he developed a dialectical approach where one thing led to another thing. And he saw communism as or Marxism as a sort of product of evolution, that there would be a natural social progress away from capitalism and away from nationalism and towards a society where there would not be private property and people would work well together. Now, in the 100 and some odd years that have gone on since then, there have been a number of countries that have declared themselves to be communist. But the kind of government that Marx envisioned never came about. Now, that doesn't mean that Marx did not make good observations about the shortcomings of capitalist society and the hardship of workers that he saw in his lifetime. He was a good observer of what he saw. He wasn't a particularly good prophet of what was going to come. And so, therefore, Marxism had a significant appeal among workers. But also what we see is that representative government and the capitalist system, to a large degree, was able to reform itself and move in ways that made it more attractive to most people. Now, it did not cure all the problems. There were still a lot of people who were not happy with what they had, but the really, really severe deprivation of the early Industrial Revolution declined towards the end of the 19th century and got better in the 20th century, although there were some major setbacks like the Great Depression. But once again, that's moving ahead of where we are in this chapter. Now, along with the movement towards socialism, the book mentions that you have the movement towards feminist or women's rights. And this, once again, is something that really begins to pick up momentum. In the United States, the women's rights movement was very much tied to abolition. But in the 19th century, was largely a period of organization for women's rights. The major breakthroughs in terms of improving the rights of women really come in the 20th century. But this period was significant. Now, also, it's important to note that, once again, this is a period where the West really becomes dominant. Other major areas of civilization in Eurasia, like the Muslim world, they saw the dominance of the West, and there were attempts to reform. Like, for instance, the Tanzimat system in the Ottoman Empire, the reform of the military system. Those were some significant attempts to reform, but ultimately they were not particularly successful. Similarly, the liberal notions that were popular in Europe had limited success in Latin America. And one of the things that really is a factor in this is that Latin American society was a very segmented society. There was a Creole or European minority in a lot of Latin America, especially northern South America, countries like Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador. There was a European minority, a very large Native American plurality or majority, And then there were significant populations of people of African descent who had been slaves. And once independence came, by and large, people in positions of power weren't all that keen on having genuine democracy among such a diverse population. And so that's why the caudillo, or, the dictator who used Republican language and who appealed to the well-off landowning class, but basically maintained control of the system. That's why that kind of government became so prominent. Now, ultimately, industrialization brought about some other major changes that were witnessed in war. In particular, the Crimean War is significant. I mean, first of all, it's the first war we actually have photographs. By this time, the camera is around. We don't really have photographs in the book. But if you go online, the Crimean War is the first war we actually have pictures. But the industrial capacity of Great Britain and France were really able to overwhelm Russia and defeat it. Basically the war, except for some exceptions, pretty much stayed on the Crimean Peninsula, which at that time was part of the Russian Empire. I mean, once again, Russia has control of it, but that's a matter of controversy because it had been part of Ukraine. But like I said, that's contemporary politics, and that's a different thing. Now, there were also some major outbreaks of war or insurrection in Asia. In particular, you had the Great Indian Rebellion. This used to be referred to as the Sepoy Rebellion, which was the word for Indian soldiers. Basically, these people, India had been ruled by the British East India Company for a long time. Indian soldiers had been used to fight wars overseas, in particular Ethiopia and in Burma. And as a result, there was a great deal of resentment to the Indian government. And so therefore, when new technology was brought in, and bullets that were greased with either pig or cow fat were required to be used by soldiers. And a lot of times these people there was an expression called bite the bullet, because back in those days you literally bit the cartridge off. Both Hindu and Muslim soldiers rebelled against this, and this resulted in a very significant mutiny or rebellion. And the British government got rid of the East India Company, and the Indian Empire came directly under the British government of the Raj, where it would stay until 1947. Now, finally, the biggest war in the West was the U.S. Civil War. This was a war that basically created the modern federal government. Prior to the U.S. Civil War, the federal government was pretty weak. The states were much more dominant. And the Civil War basically came out because of the divergence between the Southern and Northern economies. The Southern economy had become an integral part of the Industrial Revolution because it produced cotton, which made it extremely rich and also made it ever more reliant on slave labor. The northern states had industrialized and began to grow in that direction. And also, sentiment against slavery really began to grow. There were people who objected to slavery for moral grounds, and also there were people who saw slavery as something that would deny land to individual white farmers, or poorer white farmers who might want to get land and get independence. They feared that all of the land in places like California might be swallowed up by slave owners who were much richer. And so ultimately, with the emergence of the Republican Party and the election of Abraham Lincoln, America went into the Civil War, which to this day is the bloodiest war in American history. Ultimately, there would be about 1 million casualties and about 620,000 deaths. And the South would be defeated. Slavery would be ended. There would be the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments added to the United States Constitution. And African Americans legally became citizens. And for a short period of time during the Reconstruction, for about 10 years, there was really a serious effort by the federal government to enforce the new laws to have something approaching black equality. That eventually died out, and eventually by the beginning of the early 20th century, blacks in the South had pretty much lost all political power. And it wouldn't be until about another 60 years with the Civil Rights Movement that it would begin to come back again. The bottom line is that the Civil War transformed the American economy and the American political system. It made the central government much more powerful, and it also firmly moved the American government towards, moved the American economy towards industrialization. I hope that this kind of helps you get some of the major points from chapter 22. Take care.